Morning, everyone. Thank you to Dr. Pillay and to Mary for helping organize this. So today I will share with you our latest research on how word meaning is represented in the brain. And the studies I will talk about here today were done in collaboration with Dr. Jeffrey Binder, Dr. Lisa Conant, Dr. Jiaqing Tong, and Stephen Mazurchuk, who's an MD PhD student in our lab. So for a quick overview, I will start with the background. Why are we interested in studying the neural basis of word meaning of language? How mental processes may be encoded in brain in neural activity, and the three main theories or three main approaches to how lexical concept or word meaning may be represented in the brain. Then I will go over a series of fMRI and behavioral studies that tries to determine of the main three possible ways in which word meaning may be represented, which one is more likely to actually occur in the brain. And then I will end up with a few take-home messages. So semantic memory is one of the major domains of cognitive function. And it corresponds to basically everything you know about anything. Could be the functions of an object. When you see a cup, you know what it's for. People's personalities, the names of things, tastes of foods, any stories that you may know from memory, and any facts about the world. It does not include skills. So things like how to ride a bike or how to swim, that's considered procedural memory. And it has a different pattern of brain localization and impairment in neurological disease. So semantic impairments or disorders of the semantic system, they are a fairly common feature of neurological and neuropsychiatric disorders. They are a common consequence of stroke, and stroke, it's a highly prevalent disorder. You have 800,000 new strokes a year in the US alone. And as a consequence of stroke, you can have aphasia, which is language disorders, or agnosia, which is the inability to recognize an object from sight or from touch or from sound. And these are all, involve disorders of the semantic system. It affects patients with frontotemporal degeneration, which is a relatively less common disorder. But what's interesting about it is that between 10 and 30% of these patients who have the temporal variant of frontotemporal dementia, they develop a specifically semantic impairment, meaning their episodic memory is preserved, their phonological system is intact, they don't seem to have anything wrong with them except that they start losing their concepts. They start losing the representation of what things mean, of what objects mean, of what words mean, and that progresses over time. So it's known as semantic dementia, or the semantic variant of primary progressive aphasia. It is a feature of Alzheimer's disease that has become clear over time. Originally, Alzheimer's disease was thought to affect only episodic memory, your memory for things that you have lived. Now we know it also affects semantic memory. And Alzheimer's disease affects 10% of all adults aged 65 and over. It is also a feature of mild cognitive impairment, which is a light form of pre-dementia that affects 22% of adults over 65. So it's a fairly common disorder. And very recently, it has become clear that in mild cognitive impairment, you also have degradation of concepts. That is really primarily due to your semantic system dissolving, and it's not a secondary consequence of, say, executive dysfunction. And finally, schizophrenia, which is a disorder of thought, also involves semantic impairments. And interestingly, recent studies have shown that when you analyze the semantic content of the spontaneous speech of schizophrenia patients, you can actually predict, based on the semantic density of their speech, looking at people like teenagers who have never had a psychotic episode, so they're just at high risk for schizophrenia due to their genetic, their familial relationships. And the semantic content of their speech predicts whether the person will progress to become into schizophrenia with full-blown psychosis or not, with over 80% accuracy. So there's something really interesting about that. And of course, these disorders are still very poorly understood. And part of the reason is because we don't know how the regular, healthy semantic system works in the brain. And word meanings, which are also called lexical concepts, they offer us a unique window into the semantic system because, in a sense, they're like the unit of semantic memory, the basic component of what knowledge and thoughts are composed of. And because a word is actually a combination of two very different things. It's a word form, which is a phonological or vocal pattern, a word sound, or the set of actions that you produce, that you execute to produce the sound. In the case of literate societies, the corresponding written pattern. And that word form is paired with a concept or a lexical concept, which is the meaning of that word. And this pairing is arbitrary. So there's no reason why, our concept for taxi is associated with the sound pattern taxi. And we can use the sound pattern cab to refer to the exactly same concept. And different languages have different sound patterns for the same concepts. And because this association is arbitrary, we can use word forms to trigger specific lexical concepts in the mind of our research participants without interfering with the actual representation of the concept. It is common to investigate concept representation using images, for instance, presenting pictures and asking people to think about the meaning of the picture, to name the picture. But that has the limitation that if the concept has a visual component, now that it has become contaminated by the visual stimulus that you're presenting. So say if you show pictures of a dog and a horse, and you ask them, how similar are these two things? And you expect them to say that they're similar because they're both animals or both mammals. The problem is that a picture of a horse and a picture of a dog also share visual features that are not necessarily semantic. You could have stick figures of those, and there's a visual pattern that is common to those. And so now that affects the brain activity related to the concepts, and there's no way to disentangle that. With a word, the pattern that you present, which is the word form, is arbitrarily associated to the concept you're trying to elicit. And so that gives us this is a way to study the representation that comes up without affecting with the stimulus that you're using. So how is information in general encoded in the brain? What do we know about that? We know that the brain the cortex has areas that are relatively specialized for different sensory modalities, like touch, sight, and so on, motor control. And in these areas, using a neural recording of individual neurons or of clusters of neurons, especially from animals, but now we can do that in neurosurgery patients as well. We can tell how different kinds of information are represented in the activity of these neurons. So if you measure activity, neural activity in the primary visual cortex, V1, you see that the relative activity level across neurons is particularly sensitive to simple visual features like the orientation of edges or lines, and different orientations produce different patterns of activation across the neurons. If you measure neurons in a different area MT, those neurons are particularly sensitive to motion features like the speed of moving dots or the direction of movement. In the ventral premotor cortex, you can decode which hand posture a person is doing or even planning to do based on this pattern of activation across neurons there, because that's the kind of information that they encode. And important for our purposes, with function MRI, if we do a voxel level, multi-voxel pattern analysis kind of approach, we can have a lower resolution version of this activity pattern across neurons. And so we have a way to read out the information that is encoded in that area. And so the understanding how sensory and motor information is encoded in these areas of the brain has led us to developing neuroprosthetic devices, which are brain-machine interfaces that can restore sensory function or motor function. In this case here on top, it's a system that there's a camera on those sunglasses looking thing, and the camera transforms the image into a pattern of electric signals that stimulates the primary visual cortex, and that produces a sensation of vision in someone who lost their vision. There's actually a video online. You can see someone who became completely blind, and using this system, they can actually drive a car in a parking lot. There's also motor prosthetics where someone who is completely paralyzed can control robotic arms just by thinking about moving. So if we can understand how semantic information is encoded in the brain, then we should be able to develop semantic rehabilitation therapies for these disorders. We should be able to develop new tools for psychiatric diagnosis, and we should be able to develop semantic neuroprosthetics for communication so that you can bypass the word forms in the phonological system, because patients with aphasia, in many cases, they have a damaged phonological system, but their semantic system is relatively intact. So how can we have them communicate if they don't have the word forms, they only have the lexical concepts? Well, if you understand how the lexical concepts are represented, then we can decode them from the brain activation and have them communicate directly through their thoughts. And in fact, we are starting to explore that avenue with Dr. Bill Gross from the anesthesiology department. We're starting to record intracranial EEG from neurosurgical patients for tumor resection and trying to decode the content of that activity as patients are reading different words. The idea is that eventually this may lead to a sort of semantic-based neuroprosthetic device. So what do we know about how lexical concepts or word meaning is represented in the brain? We know that most of the cortex is not dedicated to specific modalities. So there are modality-specific areas, but most of the cortex is not. It's the pink areas that are not colored. We know that some of these areas are relatively specialized for higher level aspects of cognition, such as complex limb schemas, like how to grasp something, or spatial information about how things are in the environment relative to your body. And these areas, they integrate information that comes from the modality-specific areas and generate higher level, more abstract representations. And we know that there is a set of areas in the association cortex that is commonly known as the default mode network, that because these areas, they tend to become less active when you perform a task in the scanner than when you're resting. So if you have someone do, say, a memory task in the scanner or a perception decision task in the scanner, and you record their brain image, their brain activity when they're doing the task and when they're resting between tasks, these areas, they become more active when the person is resting. And so this became known as the default mode of function in the brain, is how the brain naturally is when it's not doing something else task. So default mode network. That doesn't mean that we know anything about how they work. It's just what we know is what they don't do. But it turns out that these regions, they are also the regions that are the most active when you're doing a semantic task. So if you ask participants to think about the meanings of words or the meanings of pictures, and you compare that with other kinds of tasks that do not require semantic processing, then these areas are the ones that are the most activated. And we know this in part from the work of Dr. Binder, his famous meta-analysis from 2009. And so other research, connectivity-based studies, indicate that these regions, they are all highly interconnected with each other. They're more interconnected with each other than they are with any other part of the brain, and that they integrate information that comes from all of the different modality-specific areas. They are, say, at the top of the hierarchy. If you think of the modality-specific areas as being at the bottom, then you have association areas on top of it, and these default mode network areas, they are the top of the hierarchy, the most distantly connected from the sensory motor areas. And so they encode information at the highest level of abstraction. Back in 2016, we here did a study to try to understand how the word meaning is encoded throughout the cortex. And so we had a bunch of words rated by participants in terms of how important each sensory motor feature of the meaning of the word is for that particular word. So participants answered the question for the word tomato. To what extent does the meaning of this word relate to a particular color? And so participants would say very much for tomato. If the word was something like air, they would say not at all. And we had 5 sensory motor features rated for all the words that we tested. So it was color, shape, sound, motion, and manipulability. And then we plotted on the brain surface which areas responded the most to each of these different sensory motor features, and that's what the colors indicate. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is that when we overlap them all together, and you look at the areas that responded to 4 or 5 of the features, then we see that these areas here, the white, are the ones that integrate, that combine all the 5 kinds of information. And they happen to all be in the hub default mode network areas. So that indicates that those areas really are important for representing word meaning. And this suggests that that information may actually be sensory motor information that is combined across the different modalities. Now, there are other alternatives for how information may be, for how word meaning may be represented in the brain. What I'm talking about here is sensations derived from experience. As we interact with the world on our day-to-day basis, we interact with things through our sensory systems and our motor system. And the idea is that the brain, this information percolates up the network and combines together, and that constitutes the meaning of the words up in the general semantic hubs. But it's also possible, and some researchers have strongly argued for the idea that the experiential content of words is secondary to the representation, that what the brain really cares about is the categories that these words belong to. So if it's an animal, or if it's a tool, or if it's a person, or if it's a building, that's what really matters. And because these categories, the elements in the same category tend to have similar sensory motor properties, then you see a difference related to sensory motor information, but that's secondary to the fact that what they're really interested in these areas is the categories. And more recently, researchers have been proposing another form of concept representation, which is actually based on the word forms that we use to refer to the concept. And this is called distributional hypothesis, because it has to do with the frequency of co-occurrence between different words in our natural language. The representation of a word in this case would be a weighted combination of all the other words in the language that that word commonly occurs with. So a word like cake often occurs with the words birthday, candle, eat, wedding, and so on at different frequencies. And so the representation of cake in the brain, the concept could be represented in principle as a weighted combination of all these different words. So lexical concepts represented in terms of word forms. In principle, they're all plausible. So we have to do experiments to find out what's actually happening. We need a way to directly compare these three theories quantitatively because they predict similar results. Words that tend to occur together, they tend to belong to similar categories and they tend to share sensory motor properties. And these words also tend to be in the same categories. So if you just look at the broad pattern of organization, these three theories, they predict similar results. So you need to compare them quantitatively in detail to find out which one fits the data best. And the way that we here have been doing this is by looking at the similarity structure of concepts. So words, concepts, they have a similarity relationship to each other. Everyone would tell you if you ask them that the word wolf is more similar to lion than it is to rabbit, even if they can't tell you exactly why. And that happiness is more similar to satisfaction than it is to boredom. So if you can measure the distance, the semantic distance or dissimilarity between every two words, you can create a similarity structure for a set of words. So in this case, if you're making that decision, if the brain is making that judgment based only on perceptual information, you would find that the word plate and the word spatula are more similar to each other than they are to the word table, because they share more sensory motor properties. That you can grab a plate, you can grab a spatula, you can't grab a table. They are different sizes. Plate and frisbee are very similar because they have similar sizes, similar shapes, and you grab them about the same way, even though they're different categories. Now, if you're using categories to make that determination, now plate and spatula are more similar to each other. They're both kitchen items, and frisbee is more different, and table is the most distant. And if you're using word co-occurrence information, then table and plate are more closely associated, more similar to each other, and then spatula and frisbee is the least associated. So depending on which kind of information the brain uses to determine the similarity structure of words, there's a slightly different pattern of similarity you would expect. And representational similarity analysis is a technique that allows us to compare the similarity structure predicted by a theory and the similarity structure revealed by the data. So you can actually see of the predicted patterns of similarity, which one corresponds to what's happening in the brain. So here's an example of how we can determine quantitatively the similarity or dissimilarity between three different words according to natural categories or taxonomy. Plate and spatula belong to the same utensil category. Table belongs to a different category. And those two categories, utensils and furniture, are both artifacts. The distance between plate and spatula in this case would be 2 steps from one to get from plate to spatula. But to get from plate to table, you need 4 steps. So that would be the distance between these words, between plate and spatula 2, between plate and table 4. And so you can create this similarity matrix, which tells you for each pair of words, what is the similarity distance between them, okay? You can do the same thing for a theory based on elements of experience. If you have ratings of how important each experiential feature is to the meaning of a word, like color or shape or emotional valence or, let's say, fear, and you can have as many experiential features as you want. In our case, we have 48. Then you can compute from the scores, the rating scores for each feature, for each word, how similar any 2 words are from each other. in the case of if you have 48 features, then each word is represented by a set of 48 numbers, vector. And if you take the correlation or the cosine of these two vectors, that gives you a precise measure of how similar or dissimilar they are. And then you get an experiential dissimilarity matrix for the same set of words. And same thing for contextual association or word co-occurrence information. If you compute how often each word occurs with every other word in the language, you can compute the similarity between the representations of every pair of words, and you get a distributional dissimilarity matrix. And the dissimilarity matrix that you get from these three theories, they correlate with each other. They're not completely different, but they're not identical. And so that's what we have to measure. So to what extent is each one of these kinds of information encoded in concepts? We did a study recently where we compared two models based on taxonomic information, two models based on distributional information, and two models based on experiential information. The taxonomic and distributional models we used are the most advanced models there are based on those theories. Word2Vec is an algorithm developed by Google, and it's extremely popular. It's what powers Google searches. And Glove is another kind of algorithm that produces very similar results to Word2Vec. And these algorithms are so powerful that you can actually, they can do tasks like analogy completion. So if you ask a model like this, queen is to king as woman is to, they'll say man. So they can tell, the model can abstract these properties and answer questions like that. And they also powered these more recent language models like ChatGPT, you may have heard of. They are a more elaborate version of distributional models that consider several words at a time, not just one word at a time. So they're pretty powerful. And we performed an fMRI study in which we asked participants to make a decision, a judgment about how familiar they are with the concept. And we presented them 320 different words. And then they had to tell for each word, how familiar am I with this? 1, 2, or 3. So for something like plate, most people would say 3. And half of them were objects, half of them were events. And we tested 36 participants. And they did this in the MRI scanner. So we could measure their activation pattern for each individual word and use that activation pattern to compute a neural dissimilarity matrix. So now we have a measure of how distant or how dissimilar any two words are based on their corresponding activation patterns in the brain. And then we can compare that with the predictions from each theory by looking at how well these matrices correlate with each other, in this case using Spearman correlation. And the one that gives you the highest correlation is the one that best fits the data. And we computed this neural dissimilarity matrix only from brain areas that correspond to the high-level hubs, to the default mode network hubs or semantic areas. So in the bottom here, you can see it's only the activation within the colored voxels that we're using to generate the neural dissimilarity matrix. So it doesn't include any areas that are known to participate in sensory motor processes. It does not include visual cortex or somatosensory cortex. It's only the high-level hubs. And this is the result. So the bars show how strongly each model's predictions correlate with the neural dissimilarity matrix. And in blue, you have the experiential models. In purple, the taxonomic models or categorical models. And in red, you have the distributional models. And both experiential models are correlate significantly more strongly with the neural similarity matrix than the other two models. So there was a very clear-cut result. And we repeated this in a separate experiment with a separate set of words, and we found the same result. Now, because these model predictions are correlated with each other, it's interesting to look at how much each model uniquely explains the data once you take into account what the other model explains. So we did a pairwise partial correlation. The blue bars here show this experiential model called X48. After you remove from the data all the variance explained by another model, in this case, SM8 or categorical or WordNet. And the correlation of the residual model, say the categorical model, after you remove the variance explained by X48. And what you see here is that the experiential model explains all of the variance that is explained by any of the other models. Once you take away what's explained by the experiential model, there's nothing else that the other models can explain. So what this shows us is that in the top chart, the purple and the red models, even though they significantly correlate with the neural dissimilarity matrix, they only do so to the extent that they correlate with the experiential models. So there's that taxonomic and distributional organization appears to be secondary to experiential organization. In that study, we selected ahead of time which areas we wanted to generate the neural dissimilarity matrix from. So in another study, we did the inverse. We used RSA Searchlight, and this study was led by Tony Tong, as part of his PhD dissertation. And in this approach, you look at each patch of the cortex separately. One at a time, you generate the neural dissimilarity matrix. You compare to the predictions of the models, and you put the result in that voxel. And then you move to the next patch. Once you've swept the whole cortex that way, you get a map that tells you how strongly the neural activation in each patch correlated with your model. And this is the result for the experiential model, X48. Turns out that the areas that encode the most experiential information are the areas that correspond to the default mode network or the semantic network that previous studies had indicated. And the chart on the right shows that when you look at the specific effect of the experiential model after accounting for word2vec and vice versa, or the experiential model after accounting for the categorical model and vice versa, all the variances explained by the experiential model. In the next study, we did a similar thing, but instead of using functional MRI, we used behavior. We used semantic priming, which is a measure of concept similarity based on how fast it takes you to decide whether a string of letters is a real word or not. So participants were presented with 210 real words and 210 non-words. A non-word is a sequence of letters that sounds like it could be a real word, like clean, but they don't mean anything. And the participant, if they think it's a real word, they press one button. If they think it's not a real word, they press the other button. That's all they have to do. So they don't even really need to know what the meaning of the word is or to think about the meaning of the word. They just need to recognize whether that's a word that they've seen before or not. But it turns out that your brain can't help but activate the meaning of a word whenever you see it, even if you don't need to. And that turns out to affect how fast you are to respond. The faster the meaning comes to you, the faster you are to respond. So we discarded the data from the non-words. They were just so that for the task to work, what we care about is how long they took to respond to the real words, the words that have meaning. And in this task, what we manipulated was the prime, which is a word that we flash very briefly just before each target word is presented. There is another word that we flash for just 150 milliseconds. It's really fast. And the participants are supposed to ignore that word They're just waiting for the target word to appear and stay on the screen, and that's the one they have to make their judgment on. But it turns out that, and this has been known for many decades, it's a phenomenon called semantic priming. The more similar in meaning the prime word is to the target word, the faster you are to respond to the target word. So your brain, it's like the prime word pre-activates the meaning of all the words that are semantically related to it, and that makes you faster at identifying that word when you see it later. And we did this study in 2 sessions. On one day, they would come and do the lexical decision for all words, but for each target word would be preceded by one set of prime words. In this case, apple would be preceded by doctor. In a week later, they would come back and do the second session where they would again do the same task on the same set of target words, but each target word would be preceded by a different prime word. So in this case, apple would be preceded by tomato. And then we looked at the difference in response time to the same target word when it was preceded by the different primes. Okay? So that gives you a measure of, according to the person's brain, how similar the prime and the target were to each other, and how, more specifically, the difference in similarity between prime 1 in the target and prime 2 in the target. Okay? So from that, from those pattern of response times, you can tell for each pair of words how similar they are in terms of what is the difference in response time between the two primes for the same target. And then you have a response time-based dissimilarity matrix that you can compare to the similarity matrix predicted by each of the different theories or models. And this is the result. So again, in blue is the correlation between the experiential models and their semantic priming data. In red, the same for distributional models. In purple, for categorical models. And in yellow, we have ratings that we collected separately on the internet about how similar each person thought the 2 primes were to each other. So this was not a lexical decision task. We just gave them the 2 prime words and asked them how similar are they on a scale from 1 to 10. And then separately, a separate group of subjects, we presented the same 2 words and we asked them how associated are these 2 words. So regardless of whether their meaning are the same or not, how often do they occur together? So in this case, dog and leash would be highly associated, even though they don't mean anything similar to each other. And it turns out that all of the theoretical models, distributional, experiential, and categorical, and these semantic similarity and association ratings, they all correlate with the similarity structure according to priming, very close to the noise ceiling. That's the highest correlation that any model could have with the data, given the amount of noise that is in the data, right? Even though there is a similarity pattern in the response time data, there's also noise on it, and the noise limits how much of it you can explain with a model. And all of these models and all of these ratings explain the data that was in the data, as well as any model could, given the noise. So to be able to tell these models apart, we have to look at the partial correlations. How much each model explains uniquely after you control for the predictions of the other models. And this is the partial correlation between X48, an experiential model, and each of the other 6 models. So X48 after controlling for categorical A, and categorical A after controlling for experiential 48, and so on. And again, you see that the X48 model explained all the variance that was to be explained. The other models didn't add anything. Same result as we found with MRI studies. And it turns out that even if we remove the variance explained by all the other 6 models simultaneously, everything that Word2Vec, Beloved, categorical model, and WordNet, what they explain all together at once, there's still a substantial amount of variance that is explained by the experiential models. Both of them, both X48 in Lancaster, which is a smaller model that has only 9 features. So we got pretty convincing data that indicate that these areas of the brain that encode semantic lexical concept or word meaning, they're doing so in terms of the experiential information that we use to learn about those concepts. Not in terms of categories, not in terms of word form co-occurrence. Now we ask the question, we know that it's experiential information, but what experiential information? How important is color to concept representation compared to, say, emotional valence? That's something that we still don't know. We all know that when you combine them all, they predict the similarity structure of concepts really well. But how much each different experiential feature contributes? So that's the question we're asking now. So here is what we did before. We computed the similarity between each model-based dissimilarity matrix on top with the neural dissimilarity matrix derived from fMRI data in the bottom. But now what we're going to do is to take just the X48 model, experiential model, and decompose it into 48 different models. For each feature, we will compute a separate dissimilarity matrix. So what we have 48 different dissimilarity matrices, each one based on a single feature. It could be color or shape or motion, emotional valence. And then we used a machine learning technique called cross-validated random forest regression, where this algorithm weighs each of the dissimilarity matrices from each feature so that you have explain the most variance in the neural data. And then that tells you how much each feature contributes to it. And that's what we found. When we ranked all the 48 features according to this model, these are the top 10 features: value, how important something is, manipulability, personal space, whether it's something that is typically next to you as opposed to something that is distant, color, shape, texture, pattern, vision, touch, and smell. These were the top 10 in this order. And then we created an experiential model based only on these 10 features and ignore all the other 38. So we call this the X top 10 features. And now we want to see how well does this model based on the top 10 features explains the neural similarity structure of concepts relative to the other models that we tested before. So the first blue bar is X48, which we had seen before. The second one is the top 10 features. And you can see that it performs just as well as X48. And these are 3 separate experiments with different sets of words and different participants. So the result was replicated several times. Experiment 3 has, at the time of this analysis, it had a fewer number of subjects. So the correlations are smaller because there's less subjects to ever average across. But in all of them, both models out-predict or outperform the others. And specifically, X10, based only on 10 experiential features, outperforms all the categorical and distributional models. So it turns out that those top 10 features are doing most of the work in explaining the neural data. And then we did the same for lexical decision. Now looking at the similarity matrix derived from semantic priming data, how well do these top 10 features explain? Turns out that they explain that the data better than X48. And even if you take only the top 5 features, they also explain the data better than X48. So what this tells you is that our algorithm that we use, this cross-validated random forest-based regression of semantic features really works. It really helps you isolate which features contribute the most to the semantic representation of word meaning. And so here is a visual representation of what we think is happening, what we propose is happening in the cortex in terms of how concepts are represented. So when you learn a concept, you learn it through your visual, somatosensory, motor, auditory experience in the world. So you activate elementary features that are stored in these cortical areas. And they project information upwards to modality, to multimodal areas that create more complex conjunctions of features. And these areas project up to the default mode network hubs, which generate the overall abstract summary of the experiential information, which is what we call like the top level of the concept. So as we learn, information primarily progresses or builds up from the modality-specific areas up to the heteromodal hubs. Then when we retrieve the concept, that is when you say you hear the word dog through your auditory cortex, or when you see the word dog written and then get it through your visual cortex, the concept is retrieved when this word form is relayed to the default mode network, and then it activates that abstract sensory motor cluster of information that percolates down to the multimodal areas and finally to the sensory specific, to the modality specific areas. And the extent to which this activation spreads down from the multimodal hubs to the modality specific areas depends on the task, depends on how much detail do you need to retrieve from memory about that concept. If I just ask you whether dog is a word or not a word, you don't need to access any of these sensory motor properties in detail. So the activation, you could do that just with the activation from the hubs. But if I ask you, what is a dog more similar to, a cat or a horse? Now you have to simulate the sensory motor properties in more detail, and then you have to engage the lower level features that are stored in the lower level cortical areas. So several studies find that even though modality specific areas are activated when you process concepts, they're not always activated. It really depends on the task. It depends on how rich is this reconstruction of the concept that you need to do to perform the task. So that's our little model of what's going on. We still have some way to go to prove that that's really what's going on in the brain, but the data we have so far is very strong and very encouraging. And I think we're really at the forefront of this field, and it won't take long for everybody else to see the light and agree with this. So take-home messages. Semantic impairments are a common consequence of neurological and neuropsychiatric disorders, but they're still poorly understood. Word meanings provide a unique opportunity for us to study how semantic memory is encoded in the brain because of this arbitrary relationship between word form and lexical concept. Our work has shown that lexical concepts consist of sensory motor and affective or emotional elements of experience abstracted in this hierarchy of cortical areas. And representational similarity analysis of both neuroimaging and behavioral data really allows us to determine in detail the information content of word meaning. And once we have a detailed theory of word meaning representation, then we'll be able to do all these wonderful things like semantic rehabilitation theories that really work in restoring the conceptual system, semantic neuroprosthetics for communication, tools for psychiatric diagnosis, and brain-machine interface technology, so we can control computers directly with our minds. And I will finish by reminding everybody about the Brain Expo. And don't feel shy, you're welcome to take your phones and take a picture of that pattern there. We'll take you to the Brain Expo website. If you're interested in volunteering, there's a link there where you can sign up to volunteer. If you're not interested to volunteer, you can just put in your calendar and come back on March 10 and 11.
related questions. The first one is, have you looked at or considered how languages that have a non-alphabetic presentation, such as Mandarin or something like that, that do have a relationship between the written or physical representation of the word and the semantic understanding of it, because they have characters that mean things? How would that affect the way that this is represented?
Mhm.
And the second question, and I'll let you answer both of them because they're somewhat related,
Mhm.
is have you looked at other languages and the cultural impact of this? I think of playing a game that I've played with a friend who was also a native English speaker, but from South Africa,
Mhm.
where you're supposed to play Codename. And you're supposed to get somebody to guess a word based on a word clue that you give. And she went right past cricket as an animal, because cricket's a game. Can you kind of?
Absolutely, yes. So I'll answer the second question first. That really points out the fact that the association between the word form and the meaning is culture-based, is arbitrary, is whatever we learn in the culture we grow up, what that word form means. So even if you know that the word cricket can refer to an animal, if you're more often see it as a way to refer to the game, that's what comes to your mind first. And psycholinguistic research shows that when a word is associated with several different meanings, or basically it's a homonymous word or polysemous word, when you see the word or when you hear the word, all of the meanings associated with it are activated to some extent. But the more prevalent or the more frequent meanings are activated more strongly. But the other ones are also activated to some extent, even if the person is not aware of it. So you can find semantic priming, even if your friend would show semantic priming between the word cricket and the word grasshopper, because the secondary meaning for her of the word cricket would still be active to some extent. But yeah, it reinforces the idea that the association between word form and meaning is arbitrary. And this kind of research, you really have to assume that your participants all have the same associations, the same meanings associated to the different words. So just being English speakers, as you pointed out, is not enough. They have to be English speakers of the same culture or the same subculture. Otherwise, you get this variability in terms of the concepts that are elicited by the same word form. Now, with respect to Eastern languages like Mandarin that have an ideographic notation, maybe Tony can say something about that. The structure of a Chinese character is a combination of other characters that have meaning. So I won't be able to think of any example, but how does that compare to European languages, alphabetic languages, where the word is a combination of letters, and the letters themselves don't have any meaning, they're just sounds. For our purposes, it really doesn't make much of a difference, because even in Chinese, the relationship between the meaningful components of a sign and the idea that they represent is arbitrary. So you could say that a character is made up of meaningful symbols, the same way that in English, a sentence or a phrase is made up of meaningful individual units that are combined into a larger meaning. So the relationship between the phonological or visual representation and the semantic representation is a little different. But the fact that the two are still arbitrarily related still persists. So people do studies in Chinese. There's one of the other groups that has been very productive in this area is a group from Beijing University. And they have been releasing a lot of fMRI data on the similarity structure of words based on Chinese characters. And one group recently looked at their data and tried to determine how well the similarity structure of the words corresponded to what we see in our studies here at MCW. And they found they correspond to a good extent. They're not completely different. There is some differences, and that probably has to do with cultural differences in terms of how words are associated with meanings, but they're not completely different. So I hope that helps.
It does, thank you.
Do you have an online question?
Okay.
Okay, hello. Thank you so much for an amazing talk. I wanted to ask a question regarding whether there, in your studies, you found a correlation between the anatomical correlates of areas of the heteromodal hubs, as well as the lower cortical areas responsible for the lexical context.
So the question is whether we have a correlation of between the anatomical areas,
like an anatomical correlate, yes, for the heteromodal hubs versus the lower cortical lexical concept areas.
In terms of how they relate to words, to word meaning?
Yes.
Okay. What we can tell based on our data is that when you are processing the meaning of a word, as in our task in the scanner, say rating the familiarity of the word or deciding if it's a real word or not, then the areas that are primarily engaged are the heteromodal hubs, the default mode network areas. We don't see much in the modality-specific areas. We do think that the modality-specific areas are engaged to some extent based on other data, other studies. They just not engaged nearly as much as the heteromodal hubs. We could do analysis in our data to try and focus on differences in modality-specific areas depending on the meaning of the word. It's just that that wasn't the goal here. Our goal was try to understand how that information is represented in the multimodal hubs. We do think that there is an anatomical relationship, an anatomical connection between the multimodal hubs. So the multimodal hubs, there are several large parts of the cortex: precuneus, angular gyrus, lateral temporal lobe, lateral temporal cortex. And we don't think that even though they're all multimodal or heteromodal hubs, we don't think they're doing exactly the same thing. We think they have slightly different representations. And even within each of these hubs, the representations are not the same. And that will depend on how much input each region of the hub receives from the different sensory motor areas. And that's different for each part of the hubs and for different hubs. So that's one thing that we're going to explore next is the internal structure of these hub representations, spatially in terms of the information content of each little part of the hubs.
Thank you.
So,
yeah, that answers my question. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Leo, this was really a tremendous talk. I wonder about the trajectory of the language development. And so all of the data that you showed here was sort of normative adult speakers. How does these networks develop in childhood?
So how does these semantic networks develop in childhood? That's an excellent question. And I wish we could look into that more directly with developmental studies in children. There are people doing that behaviorally, not so much in terms of neuroscience, but developmental psychology. It's a big topic: language development, concept formation in young children. We think that it's similar to what I showed here in that slide about the learning of a concept. As the child experiences for the first time a dog, and they hear someone calling a dog, they process these set of features that occur together: the dog shape, the dog texture, the dog size, and they associate that set of features with the word that they're hearing. And then later on, when they hear the word, they can reactivate those features. children start learning concrete concepts first. So objects like, bottle and dog and mummy, so concrete things. Only later on, they start learning concepts like infinity and information. And I would say many people never get to learn what those mean. What is infinity, right? But anyway, does that address your question? Finish?
If there are areas of the brain that during tasks, that are not specifically engaged in processing information relevant to that task, but are upregulated or downregulated as a control mechanism. So, activation that is related to cognitive control. If there are activations of that kind, would they emerge as, or in the paradigms that we typically use, would they emerge as heteromodal hubs? Even though they are not specific to the task, but they're just being upregulated because they are allowing a certain computation to happen or required for activating a certain area.
That's an excellent question. So we have areas of the brain that we know are particularly important for executive processes like directing attention, for maintaining working memory, decision making. And these areas, they get activated regardless of the stimulus that you're using in your task, whether it's words, whether it's pictures, or it's lines. If you have to pay attention on something, those areas get engaged. And so, what does our data say about the kind of information that is activated in these areas? Do we see those areas in our studies? We do. So if you remember the map I showed earlier, there is a lot of prefrontal areas that are engaged in semantic processing, left inferior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus. This data shows that they do encode semantic information in sensory motor form, just like the hubs in the back of the brain. That doesn't mean that those areas, they are primarily stored with that information. We think that that information is primarily stored in the posterior hubs, which are more directly connected to the sensory motor areas. But because these areas are used to retrieve that information based on the task, so these areas, they direct your brain to perform the task. I have a word form, I need to retrieve the meaning, so I need to activate the relevant cortical areas that store that information. And so they activate the posterior brain areas. And because that direction is very precise at the microscopic level, the information that is activated here is reflected in the executive area as a consequence of what's being activated. So even though that information may not be permanently stored there, say, even though this area may hold any kind of information because it's a domain general area, during the task, its activation pattern will reflect the content that is being activated in the posterior. So we believe that areas like inferior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, superior frontal gyrus probably have a more executive role with these tasks rather than storage of abstracted information. They're more related to pairing the goal of the task. So what is the individual trying to do at that moment with the information that is needed to perform the task?
Is there a way to support that?
There are ways to investigate that. We haven't done that yet, but it's a natural thing to investigate. One way is to vary the task demands, say, doing lexical decision as opposed to semantic decision. In lexical decision, the semantic information is incidental to the task. It happens almost like a reflex. In semantic decision, That's like what you're trying to do at your goal. So I would expect that these prefrontal areas will show more semantic content activity in a semantic test than in a lexical decision test. But the other areas, it shouldn't matter. Or at least shouldn't matter as much. And also, the prefrontal areas or the executive related areas, they should also have a stronger representation of the goal of the task. So if you say compare different tasks that have different goals, that difference should be reflected more strongly in the prefrontal areas than in the posterior areas. While the posterior areas should be more tuned to the actual content of the information that is used for the task.
If you had much higher temporal resolution, would you be able to kind of see if one, say, the prefrontal areas kick in earlier than the?
We can, and we have actually collected an MEG data set with a similar paradigm, and it's still waiting to be analyzed, but it definitely can tell us, on a millisecond basis, the order in which different areas are activated. And in the case of a test like ours, where the word is presented visually, you see first the primary visual cortex gets activated, then the visual words form area gets activated, and then these other areas here start becoming activated, and then they sort of reverberate through for a few hundred milliseconds, and then they fade. So if you do this analysis with the goal of differentiating the time course of these regions, you should be able to see that here.
Thank you very much for a wonderful grand rounds. Everybody have a lovely Friday.
Thanks.